Welcome to our study on the resurrection. We're actually probably going to make this a bare bones study. It's not part of the Sonship curriculum. We'll be back on that next Sunday. But we're going to step aside today and we're going to do some work on the death, burial, and resurrection. Understand this, that the Lord Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the feast days. Now let me give you some things right here at the outset that'll just kind of get all of us thinking about things the same way. When we're going to be looking at, because as we go through, we can put it up on the timeline, but what you're really looking at is, you're looking at the days leading up to the Jewish Passover. Now look, this is not what this sermon is about, and this is not in your notes. You may already be aware of it, but let me just say that when we're talking about those issues of the death, burial, and resurrection, those are all in accordance with feast days. We've talked about those 7 major feast days in Israel's program. Jesus is born into this world on the Feast of Tabernacles. That gives you an idea of where to actually place His birth on the calendar. Israel has 2 calendars. They have a normal calendar that runs from the first of the year to the end of the year, and then they have a religious calendar. And that calendar doesn't run, like for us, our calendar runs from January to December. But if you've ever worked for a business, they have a financial calendar that may not start until April. So in the financial year, April starts the first month. Well, Israel has a religious calendar. And in that religious calendar, you have 3 feasts in the first month. And then you have 1 feast, and I'm going to name these feasts for you, that sits by itself. And then you have 3 more feasts in the 7th month. And we know what those are. Those get celebrated. Now you understand that out of those feasts, there are 3 feasts that are high holy days. And I'm going to be using a lot of terminology, but I'll tell you what it is. These are days when everyone, if they were at all able, were going to, wherever they were living in the world, they would travel to Jerusalem and celebrate the feast day in Jerusalem. One of those days is Passover. The Passover celebrated them coming out of Egypt. Remember, when they put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel of their home, and as the death angel came through Egypt, if he saw the blood, he passed over that home and didn't touch anyone there. If a home didn't have that, then the firstborn son of that home died. And that included Pharaoh's. That was the thing that actually caused Pharaoh to say to the children of Israel and to Moses, just get out. And that plague was everywhere. Well, what they did is they would celebrate that Passover there. There was another one, and we know about this. This is the Feast of Pentecost. And that was a day when everybody would come in for that feast. And the other one was Tabernacles. So you have 3 feasts that you would come into Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 2, remember it says, and there were devout men that had come in for the feast out of every nation under heaven. Those were people, and remember it lists them over there in Acts 2. Parthians, Medes, the Edomites, it gave you this whole list of them. There were Jewish families who had moved to these areas. Their children had been born there, and they had raised their children, and many of them, they grew up speaking a different language, not the Hebrew language. They grew up speaking a different language. And even in the time of the New Testament, when Greek was being spoken, they were still speaking a different language from that. That was the miracle of the tongues. How hear we every man in the language wherein we were born. In other words, when Peter was talking, this guy heard it in this language, that guy heard it in a different language. That was the miracle of that thing. Well, we could talk about that, but I'm really getting off track. What I'm trying to say is that's why there were so many people in Jerusalem at that time, because they had come in for the feast day. And so that's a wise thing for God to have the Spirit descend on Pentecost in the day of Acts, because it will be exposing as many of the Jewish people as possible. If this had just happened during the year, it would only be the people who normally lived in Jerusalem. But in this case, you're in a feast day where people are in from all over the world. And so they're being exposed to this truth of what is happening. Tabernacles, of course, this is going to make the full circle. Because the first thing that we know that fulfills, I say that Jesus, when He fulfills the feast days, first of all, His birth is on the Day of Tabernacles. Because He is God in the flesh, and He is He is tabernacling among men. And that's what He does. This is going to come all the way full circle from His birth all the way to the end when God sets up His residence on this earth and He begins to tabernacle among His creation in the kingdom. And so that tabernacles is actually going to start the ball rolling with the birth of Christ and bring it all the way around to the establishment of the kingdom, where God the Father and God the Spirit are setting up their residence on this earth. We're, of course, going to have glorified bodies. We'll be out in the creature in the heavenly places at that time. So as you understand that Jesus is finding a way to fulfill every single one of the feast days, that would be true. Now, let me just to cover them in your mind, let's talk about these last feast days. Because when you get over here to the end, you have 3 feast days. You have the Feast of Trumpets, you have the Day of Atonement, and then you have the Feast of Tabernacles. And those all happen in the same month. In fact, there's just days apart. Now, just to show you how these feast days are going to work, when the Lord comes back at His advent, I'm saying this, when the end of the tribulation is over, when the tribulation itself is over, Daniel's 70th week has run its course, then what you're going to have is you're going to have a period of time in which darkness is going to envelop the earth. Those 30 days of darkness are called the days of Teshuvah. Those are days of judgment. And remember, He talks about when the Lord returns that He will pierce the darkness. You know, and He's using, and the brightness of His coming, and every eye shall see Him. That's because the world is going to be engulfed into an abject darkness for 30 days. And then what you're going to have is you're going to have the Lord return. And that's going to happen, that second advent is going to happen on the Feast of Trumpets. That's why, there's so many reasons why people want to put the rapture into that Feast of Trumpets. But you understand that today, in the dispensation of grace, we're not fulfilling any Jewish feast days. So to look at the calendar and determine that in the 7th month of Israel's religious calendar, which would be our September, somewhere around in there, it kind of shifts, because that's the other thing you need to understand about the Jewish calendar. They're on a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. Our year is 365 and a quarter days long. So what happens? Every 4 years, we add a day to the calendar to make up for that, because it's not perfect. So every year, you've got an extra quarter of a day in there, and so we add a day to February every 4 years. It's a leap year, and February has 29 days. Israel doesn't go on a solar calendar. They went on a lunar calendar. They went by the moon. And the phases of the moon happen every 30 days. Well, wait a minute. We have some months that have 31 days. So in their year, if the year runs 365 and a quarter days. If you have 12 30-day months, you only have 360 days. So they're 5 days short of our year. Do you ever wonder, we'll talk about this term Easter in a minute. You ever wonder why Easter jumps around on the calendar? I mean, now, let's see, what is, today's the 5th? Today's the 5th of April. But there are times when it won't even be in the same month as it was in times past. It'll shift around. The reason is because that the Passover is on the Jewish calendar. That calendar is only 360 days long. So you're losing 5 days every year. If you're on the 5th now, in 2 more years, you'll be 10 days off from that. So you see that's going to make a difference. You can actually swap from one month to that. That's why it always sneaks up on me. Last week, we didn't even talk about it because I just wasn't aware it was already here. All right, so here's my point. So what we do is every 4 years we add a day. What Israel does is they go a longer number of years and they add a leap month. They add another 30-day month. It's something like Adar Bet or something like that. Someone's going to hear me say it and say, that's not exactly how you say it. Okay, I get that. And you know what? I didn't put it in the notes, so I'm just trying to recall something that was in my head from a lot of years ago because I haven't looked at it. But they add a leap month to their calendar to bring everything back up to a starting place, and then it kind of goes again. Okay, the other thing you need to know is our days run from 12 o'clock midnight to 12 o'clock midnight the next day. And that's how we separate the days. Israel doesn't do that. In fact, we do this. We would say, because we start at midnight, we would say 1 o'clock in the morning, because that's morning to us. And the way Israel counts time is very different. They don't go from midnight to midnight. They go from sunset to sunset. And if you're going to count that as a time, their days start, if you're going to count that as a time, they would call it at 6 p.m. I'm using the p.m. for us. At our 6 o'clock in the evening, that would be the start of their day. So here we are at 25 minutes to 2. So in about, 4 hours and 25 minutes? In 4 hours and 25 minutes, to the Jew, it's going to be Monday. Now for us, we're looking at that and we're going, we got almost 10 and a half hours left in the day. But not if you're a Jew. Because if you're going to go home and eat supper, you'd be eating it Monday. And it would be Monday night. Because that's the other thing. We say morning and evening. The Jews do it just the opposite. Because if you're starting your day at 6 p.m., what comes first for them? Yeah, okay, so they say evening comes first and then morning. That's why in Genesis it says, and the evening and the morning were the first day. That it doesn't say it the way we would say it. So that's enough. And there's one other thing I want to show you about time before we start this. Is everybody with me so far? I'm not asking if you could get up here and draw the diagram, but I mean you're with me. They don't start at midnight. They start at about 6 in the evening. And it's really from sunset to sunset. They don't say morning and evening. They have evening first, so it's evening and morning. And here's the other thing. Over in the Gospel of John, Jesus makes a statement about the truth of something. And when He does, He says this, are there not 12 hours in a day? And when you read that, what do you instantly come to your mind? Well, wait a minute. There's 24 hours in a day. But He's talking from the Jewish understanding. So when you talk about 12 hours in a day, let me just erase some of this because I'm going to run out of room on all of this. So Let me just do this. Okay. So when he says there are 12 hours in a day, here's how it happens. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the night for the Jew is not counted as hours. It's called watches. And those watches are listed in the Gospel of Mark. And those watches go from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, from 9 o'clock to midnight, from midnight to 3 o'clock, and from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. And this one is called evening. So if you say, I'll see you in the evening, you're talking between 6 and 9 o'clock at night. From 9 to 12 was called midnight. That was the name of the watch. It was just a 3-hour segment of time. From 12 to 3 is called cockcrow, which I don't know if the rooster really crows between 3 and 6, but that's the name of the watch. And then from 3 to 6 is called morning. And then after that you have hours. So from 6 to 7 in the morning is called the first hour of the day. 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock is the second hour of the day. And so what you do is the 12th hour is going to be from 5 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's going to be the 12th hour. And that's why Jesus said, are there not 12 hours in a day? Because there's 12 hours and 4 watches. And so when he says to the remnant, watch, for you know not what hour your Lord doth come. He may come at evening, midnight, cockcrow, or morning. And he's giving them those watches for them to go through the night with. But then when you get that, because this is what the evening or the night is composed of, 4 watches. This is the day. So remember on the day of Pentecost when Peter is speaking with other tongues and some men said he is full of new wine. He's drunk. And what was the answer to that? These men are not drunken as you suppose, seeing it is but the 3rd hour of the day. What's the 3rd hour? Look at what we've got up here so far. What would be the 3rd hour of the day? Yeah, it's before 9 o'clock in the morning. So when you see those things, you have to realize that the way that the Jewish mind is writing and the Jewish mind is understanding, all of that's very different from the way we do it. Now, why am I telling you this? Because what we're going to do is and I'll just give it to you up front, is we're going to start back here 6 days before the Passover, because the Passover is the day that Jesus dies on the cross. Now, I know that we're used to saying Easter. It's in our vocabulary. We kind of learn it. And when we were kids growing up, you know what? I can remember, you got dressed up, you went to church, and afterwards the kids went out and they hunted Easter eggs. But let me just say a word about this. And look, I'm not trying to tutor and governor you on this. This is your deal. Every son and daughter will make their own decision. And I should have put this in the notes. But good night. They're already 30-something pages long. I mean, everything I think I should have put in there, we'd just be looking at an encyclopedia. So here's what I'm going to tell you. There was a pagan holiday during the time of Jesus in which a false goddess was worshipped, and the spelling of that was Ishtar. That holiday, through the passage of time, actually the spelling and the pronunciation changed slightly to Easter. This was the goddess of fertility. Now, the unsaved pagan Gentiles worshipped Ishtar. Look, I am not saying to you at all that anybody in this room is worshiping Ishtar. Most people wouldn't know her if she walked in. Actually, she is no God, so she couldn't walk in. But I'm just saying. I get that. So that's not what I'm trying to say. But what I'm saying is, Easter was never the same thing as Passover. Passover was the Jewish feast day. And that feast day happened at a certain time in the year. It had to do with how the year was going. Easter was the pagan holiday. Now, I haven't studied this, so I don't know the answer to this. But at some point, because they're so close together on the calendar, and by the way, let me just tell you about this. John the Baptist was going to be beheaded. Passover, I think I've got this right. You probably remember this, Mark. Passover had already taken place, but Herod said he didn't want to kill John the Baptist until after Easter was over. In other words, he wanted the pagan holiday to pass. So you see from that point, and I should have just showed this to you in the Scripture, but what you understand is that Easter and Passover were two separate events. They happened pretty close together, but they were not, but they weren't the same holiday. Now, at some point, people took that name of that holiday, Easter, and put it for what we celebrate, the resurrection of Christ. The truth is, the resurrection of Christ on Passover, look, this is when He is crucified on the cross. The next, just right after that, right after Passover, you're going to get to another feast day, which is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it is on that day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that Jesus is buried in the tomb. And then there's another feast day that comes after that, and that is the Feast of Firstfruits. There's those three feasts together on the first day of the first month of the religious calendar. And this is Jesus' resurrection. And He does them on those days. Now, if you can remember, I can tell where this is going. There's no way I'm going to get through all of this. I can tell you right now. I already know. But I think I can give you the important parts, and you can take the notes home and you can look at them. If it was Sonship, we'd take an extra week to do it. But you know what? I printed up notes. You can take them home. You can look at them. It'll walk you through the process. So we're going to go as far as we can go with it, but I'm going to try to talk you through the main points of this. When the Passover was being celebrated, the Jewish families, you know what they did? They would commemorate the Passover plague of the death of the firstborn in Egypt that allowed them to come out of Egypt. So they celebrated that every year so that that was in remembrance from generation to generation. And here's what they do. They would set up a table. In fact, we've done a thing like this here. Way back when I first came here, we did this one time just to show everybody what that was like. And there was different things. There was a salt water that was on. No, there was a salt. What? Oh man, I'm trying to think about it. I haven't done it so long now. Anyway, there's all these things that are on the table, and there's certain things are done in order. And there was the salty. Help me out, Sandy. There was the bitter herbs. It was the bitter herbs that they were in salt water. It was parsley, and it was in salt water. And you would eat that, and you know what that was supposed to remind you of? The tears that they shed in Egypt under bondage. And then there were other things. And why the unleavened bread? What is bread that is leavened? It has yeast in it. And why does it have yeast in it? So it'll rise. But when they were at the Passover back there in Egypt, and God said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to eat this Passover meal. And I don't want you to put leaven in the bread. And I want you to eat it not sitting down, but standing up with your shoes on your feet. Why? Because you're getting ready to leave. And as soon as you get the signal, you're going to be gone. So it was unleavened bread because they didn't have time to let the bread rise. So you just mix it without leaven, you bake that bread, and there you are. Do you see all of this? So every Jewish family at that time of the year, they would go through, and it's called a Seder. S-E-D-E-R. And they would do this Seder service, and as they would do this, the kids would grow up hearing, and they would read certain passages that talked about God bringing them out of Egypt. The kids would grow up with this. And if you had a small family, here's what you would do. On the day before the Passover, you would kill the Passover lamb. The next day, that lamb would be prepared and eaten. And the rule was this: you had to eat it all. Now, if my kids were living with me, no problem. But if it was just me and Billy, and we had to eat a whole lamb, because you couldn't have any left over. So you know what? If you were a family that couldn't eat the whole lamb, what were you to do? You had to get with another family, and they had to share the lamb. You know, that way it could all be done. There were certain things that had to be done in the middle of that, in the middle of all this deal, and there were things that you would drink of the fruit of the vine, and you would eat this kind of bread, and you would do this parsley, and you would do all these things. And then you stop in the middle, and there would be a real meal that would be served in the middle. And while everybody was eating that meal, what would happen is there were these matzah breads. And the way we always have them, they were in big squares like this. And you would take those 3 matzahs and you would wrap them up in a napkin, and they were called the afikomen. And what the father would do is because you used those in the ceremony, and he would wrap that up and he would go hide the afikomen. And then when the meal was over, the kids would go hunt for it. And whoever found the afikomen and brought it back, there was a prize that was given to the one that found it. And so the afikomen, that was something then that you would unwrap once it was found, and you started to do the meal is over, the kids have found it wherever it was hidden, they brought it back, and you know what, there was a lot of strange things. I'm going to get caught up on this, and I shouldn't. There was always an empty plate set at the table, and it was there for who? No, not for Jesus. It was for, well, it wasn't for the Messiah. It was for Elijah. In case Elijah the prophet showed up to herald the coming of the Lord. They always set a place for Elijah. Of course, he never showed up, right? Because that hasn't happened yet. But my point is, and so they would take that afikomen, and when Jesus was doing the Passover supper with the disciples, he did something at that point no one had ever heard before. In all the generations of doing the Seder Passover, no one had ever done it. Because Jesus unwrapped that napkin, and don't ask me who hid it and who found it among the 12. I have no clue that they did that. But he unwrapped that napkin, and he took that bread and he broke it. And you do that, you do break it, and you're going to give it out. But when he broke it, he said this: "This is my body which is broken for you." Nobody had ever heard that before. But when Israel's Messiah was on this earth, he knew exactly what that was a picture of. When that was broken, even the high priest back then, they just knew they were breaking it and handing it out. Jesus said, "This is my body which is broken for you." And then when they took that next cup, you know what he said about that? "This is the blood of the New Testament which is shed for you. Drink ye all of it." Not drink all of it, but all of you drink it. That was the part of that Passover that pointed forward to that. And so when the Passover came, and we're going to watch this, Jesus starts His ministry when He's 30 years of age. And when He starts that ministry, here's what you're going to see. He starts His public ministry. Let's just start it here and pull the timeline out. And after He starts that public ministry, you're going to see that He spends 40 days being tempted of the devil in the wilderness. Do you remember that? And so here we are. So He starts His ministry. And then after He starts His ministry, then He's got 40 days that He's tempted of the devil in the wilderness. And then He's going to go over to the marriage in Cana. And then, several months later, He's going to come to His first Passover. And the Bible's going to talk about that He went to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Well, from here to here is almost a month and a half. And then you've got Him traveling to Cana, and He's at the wedding in Cana. Remember, He turns the water into wine. Everybody knows that. And then some more time goes by, and what you've got here, what you've got from here to here is about 6 months. And then you're going to find, as we go through the Gospels, there's going to be a second Passover that Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem to celebrate. And then there's going to be a third Passover. He's doing some things in His ministry, and then suddenly it'll say, and Jesus left for Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Passover. And that's the third one. And then you're going to come to, He's there for one more Passover, the fourth one. But look, if He's here for 6 months, and there's the first one, this gives you a year in between Passover, so there's a year and a half, 2.5, 3.5 years. There's His ministry, 3.5 years. And where is He on that fourth Passover? While they're slaying those Passover lambs, He is hanging on the cross. That's where His fourth Passover is. And that's why the Scripture says He is our Passover. In other words, He's the fulfillment. All those lambs. And when they selected those lambs, remember they had to be without spot and without blemish. Why? Because they pictured something. And they may not have known what it was they were picturing. In fact, they didn't know what it was picturing. And there's a reason they didn't know. Because when you read those things back in the Old Testament, not even Satan could decipher those things to see what was happening. He did not realize what was happening in the death of Christ. You know what he thought was going on? He had incited the Jews to kill their Messiah. And God took Him in His own craftiness, because that's exactly what needed to happen. And that's why Jesus doesn't fight it. He knows what He came to do. But Satan doesn't. It's almost like Satan's going, I know what I'll do. If he won't, the 40 days in the wilderness, if he won't bow down and worship me. By the way, I have too much to talk to you about. I made a phone call this week, and I called Mark and I said, hey, I'm looking at some stuff in Romans 13. I want you to come over and let us talk about it. And then I called John Schallenberger and Loopy, and I said, look, I know Loopy was just here, but I want you guys to drive up here, because I want us to sit down. We're looking at some things that I think are very important to our sonship, and they're kind of different. And so I want us to look at them and put them under the microscope. And so we spent 28 man-hours looking at these things this past week, putting all this under the microscope, talking about every aspect of it, finding out what wasn't right and kind of what was right and all that bit. And why am I telling you that? I started to tell you that story for a reason. Who are you people? What are we doing here? I mean, it's a wonder I even know who I am. All right, it'll come back to me. What was I saying to you when I started that story?
Him on the cross when they were killing the lambs. And Satan thinking that
Satan didn't know it.
Okay, yeah, Satan didn't, okay. Okay, and what he was doing on the cross for us, Satan had no idea about. But when you read back in those Old Testament passages, we know what they are now because of hindsight. But Satan couldn't figure that out. So he thinks he's killing. There's a reason I told you that story. It'll come to me, and whenever I am in the sermon, when that comes to me, I will stop and blurt it out so that you'll... Okay, so if that happens, just know, I haven't completely lost my mind. I just don't want to forget again. He doesn't realize what's happening. He thinks he's being executed as a criminal between two thieves. And what God is doing is having Satan accomplish exactly what needed to be done for his undoing.
And Jesus became God's Lamb of God.
He is the Lamb, that's what John called him, the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world. And he was without spot and blemish. Hence the Passover lamb had to be without spot and blemish. That still didn't tell me about the story, but anyway. So all of that is working. So the fourth Passover, he is, when they're slaying those Passover lambs, he's on the cross saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But he knows why he's there. I mean, all that's working according to God's plan. And that's when the battle on the cross is taking place. We'll talk about that another time. All right, so now that we've laid all of this groundwork, here's the point I got off on this by saying, is that we talk about Easter and everybody talks about Passover, but folks, the resurrection is not on Passover, it's on Firstfruits. You know what you're celebrating today? Not Passover, Firstfruits. He is the firstfruits of them that slept. That's what the resurrection is about. And in His death on the cross, Christ is accomplishing, Satan didn't know it, but in His death on the cross, He wasn't just dying for Israel, but He was also making a provision for us, the new creature, the body of Christ, that He had kept secret, that He knew about from the beginning. And there was something He did on the cross, and when He was put in the tomb, while He is in those 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb, He's not just marking time. There is something He is doing that we are the beneficiaries of. In other words, there's a spiritual work that's being done by Him in His burial that we become the recipients of. Can I remind you of Romans chapter 6? For we are buried with Him by baptism unto death. Remember that? That was part of our identity in Christ. That burial, we not only died with Him when we received Him and got set free from enslavement to sin, we were buried with Him, and we are also going to be raised with Him. Therefore, we will be seated with Him. Paul says we are co-seated with Him in heavenly places in Ephesians. Now, I know we're not over there yet, but I'm just saying, if you're talking about Romans, we are and raised to walk in what? Newness of life. You got a whole new life now. And you are a new creature, and all that begins to be unfolded for you. So really, we're not celebrating Passover today. We're celebrating Firstfruits today. And the reason that I don't like to stop and do this kind of thing every year and do something at Christmas on His birth and do something at Thanksgiving, which isn't a religious holiday, and do something at whatever else, is because we don't observe days. We're in the dispensation of grace. We're not Jews and we're not under the law, and we don't have a Passover supper every year to remind us of when we came out of Egypt. You didn't come out of Egypt. And you know what? Your ancestors didn't come out. We're Gentiles. And so we didn't do that. But this is what they do to remember that history. And so all of those things, by the way, all those things they did, when they had the sacrifices in the temple, remember earlier when I did the three feast days up there, and we talked about the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. The Day of Atonement, remember, that's the day that the priest would make a sacrifice, and he would go in, he'd sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat, and they'd take a goat, and remember, they'd put the blood on him, they'd release him into the wilderness, and that was the scapegoat, and God would forgive the sins of people for 1 year. Those things were integrated into Israel's program for so long that once now their program resumes in the coming day of wrath, once this dispensation of Gentile grace is over and we've been taken out by the blessed hope and Israel's program is resumed, the one thing Israel really wants to do, and I'm talking about the apostate nation, is they want to rebuild that temple and get those sacrifices going again. Because how long has it been since they've had a Day of Atonement? There has been no temple over there. There has been no Day of Atonement celebrated in the way the law prescribed for it. And look, your Father is not interested in that. All those years that I was in church, people would talk about, I even heard a guy say, he was a truck driver, and he said, they've loaded up the stones in these trucks. I drove one of those trucks up to New York just waiting to ship it to Israel to rebuild the temple. Is that true? He may have thought it was. Here's what I know. I've been to Israel. They don't need stone. They have plenty. And really, if you're in Israel, do you want stone shipped in from the U.S.? I would be thinking you'd be using the stone right there on the ground, wouldn't you? You'd be cutting that out. Okay, but all that debate aside, why isn't God interested in them rebuilding that temple? Because those sacrifices are no good anymore. Because of what happened on Passover, the one sacrifice that did away with sin also did away with the sacrifices. That's why in Hebrews he says, don't you guys know the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin? Christ made one sacrifice forever, which did away with the sacrifices. But if you don't believe that the historical Jesus of Nazareth is Israel's Christ, all you know is we got to get the temple rebuilt and we got to get the sacrifices going. And now Christian churches all over America are praying that Israel will rebuild the temple. Well, they need to get rid of that Dome of the Rock, and they need to rebuild the Jewish temple over there so they can restart their sacrifice. Do you understand what you're saying when you say that? You're promoting Satan's counterfeit to replace the real thing that got done. That's not in play anymore. Look, something better. Something better. More excellent. That's what's happening. Not bulls and goats. The writer of Hebrews said, if those things could take away sin, how come the high priest has to go in every year and keep doing it? He says, but Christ made one sacrifice forever. So if you're a believer in Christ out there when Israel's program starts back up, you're admonished, don't go in and participate with them. Because the Antichrist is going to rebuild that temple. And he is going to allow them to restart those sacrifices. Don't go and participate with them. In fact, he says, when you see that abomination of desolation stand in the holy place, flee to the mountains. Because you're about to get cut off. And there's not going to be an escape. Now, to us, that sounds pretty cut and dried. But do you understand that for a lot of people, to walk away from the Jewish temple and the sacrifices of the temple would mean that you have been disowned by everybody in your family? To use the mafia expression, he's dead to me. And you know what? And that's a hard pill for some people to swallow. You know how much pressure is going to be exerted? I mean, I could make an argument for it. So could you. If Sarita was saying, hey, I can't go in and participate in that with you guys, I'd be going, are you forsaking Moses and the law? It's written in your law, in the Torah. What is wrong with you, Sarita? The next thing you know, you'll be violating the prophets. So now, you know what? You're throwing the law away and you're throwing Moses away. Moses, that we celebrate, that brought us out of Egypt. And you know what? After a while, you're going, well, I mean, really, is that what I'm supposed to be doing? I mean, you know, you start thinking, you've got to remember by the way, they don't have what we have. Although Romans 13 said, you don't know how much time you have left, this opportunity to get your sonship that we discussed last week. If you're the believing remnant, you don't have much time at all. Good thing I'm not in the tribulation teaching it. They'd all be going, great, the whole 7 years will be up. We ain't going to be simple sons yet. But I mean, but there's some things that God is doing in the day of wrath that allows for that. Kind of an acceleration of that process. They've got to have it. Okay, so the alarm went off. So here's what I'm going to let you do. I'm going to let you get up, stretch your legs, come back, and then we're going to start the notes.
Well, is it exterminated right now with the Muslims?
That's a good question. You can cut me off here, Mark.